This lecture is meant to accompany the article reading Religion, Evolution, and Prehistory. We'll focus on when religions originated, how and why they originated, and what their actual form and nature were like. First, the author takes on the question of a bioevolutionary origin for religion. That would be a naturalistic sort of biological explanation, genetic, for the existence of religion. But based on my reading, I haven't seen anything that I would consider to be really that convincing in regard to the arguments that have been put forth for this theory. I'm not a huge fan of it. The anthropologist Scott Atran, I think, ably lays out some of the reasons why the sort of Darwinian evolution of religion doesn't appear to seem likely. And I'm on page 43 here, and drop down about 15 lines. And I'm going to read this passage here on page 43. And I'm quoting the author. He writes that, and then quote, "The reasons religion should not exist are patent. Religion is materially expensive and unrelentingly counterfactual and even counterintuitive. Religious practice is costly in terms of material sacrifice, emotional expenditure, and cognitive efforts, and counterfactual networks of beliefs. Sacrifice also includes that's the end of the quote. Then the author of the article continues, sacrifice also includes material expenditures, bodily mutilation, the killing of animals and humans, and celibacy. The willingness to hold to counterfactual and counterintuitive beliefs and to make sacrifices on the basis of such beliefs is a measure of faith and piety. The more extreme the commitment and the greater the willingness to sacrifice, the greater the faith and piety." So in a purely Darwinian fitness context, religion would not seem to be a good bet. In other words, it would not be naturally selected for. Another point is that we're not discussing the evolution of the eye or the brain or bipedalism, all of which are universal and common throughout Homo sapiens. We're talking about religion, or more accurately, religions, that come in thousands and thousands of different versions with very little common ground between them. So that's another issue. Also in this context, the ideas of Edward Tyler, an English anthropologist towards the end of the 19th century, are discussed. Tyler's basic idea, and I'm going to roughly outline it here, his basic idea was that people reasoned that when one dreams, one doesn't actually go anywhere, right? Although in your dreams you do. You can dream of traveling to other places, engaging in all sorts of strange scenarios, but yet when you watch someone else sleep, you see they're just in their bed. So there's this notion that quite apart from the physical body, there's also another aspect to the body, a so-called spiritual aspect, if you will. And then once you posit that idea, it's just a small step to, for example, contemplating an afterlife, because after all, when the physical part, the body dies, well, perhaps the spiritual part goes on. And then again, it's just very small steps to the idea of a soul, because that's the soul would be part of the spiritual body, and of other things having souls, and of gods and angels and so forth and so on. So that's Edward Tyler's idea, and it sort of fits here. All right, another question here is when? When did it originate? Well, when we get to the very end of this lecture, I'm going to give you my take on this, since I am a quote-unquote scholar of religions. That's my anthropological specialty. Well, there have been two time periods that have been looked at. The Middle Paleolithic, which is 200,000 to 40,000 years ago, and then the Upper Paleolithic, which is 40,000 to 15,000 years ago. Really, the Middle Paleolithic was interesting for a while because it was assumed that Neanderthals were practicing some form of religion. There seemed to be some indication that there were cave bear cults, for example, that you read about, perhaps intentional symbolic burials. Also, maybe ritual cannibalism, and you read about all of those things. But frankly, those have all been largely discredited. At least they're no longer interpreted the way they once were. I think people were a little bit overly enthusiastic when they were trying to extrapolate from the data we had to full-blown religion. Also, too, there's another matter of human evolution. Neanderthals are an evolutionary cousin. They're not on a direct line leading to Homo sapiens. Right? There was an earlier form of hominin known as Homo heidelbergensis, and both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens diverged out of that common foundation. So actually, Neanderthals are not technically in the human line, even though they're genetically, of all the hominins, in other words, the bipedal fossil humans, they're genetically the closest to us. Once we move to the Upper Paleolithic, it seems certain that we have reached something we could refer to as religion. We do find intentional human burials there, the appearance of symbolic art and aesthetic art like necklaces and beads and things like that, and then also cave paintings. And by the way, the Upper Paleolithic is squarely in the time period when Homo sapiens has already appeared on Earth. The earliest Homo sapiens appeared on Earth 195,000 years ago. And I'm going to talk more about that a little bit later. So I think we're on very solid ground here with an Upper Paleolithic date. In fact, as you'll see later, I would push it back further than that. Okay, so how did they originate? Well, this, as the author points out, this cannot be known with certainty, but certainly that doesn't stop people from putting forth interesting theories and explanations. There's three basic approaches here. The first approach are the psychological and sociological approaches. For example, religion is a way to explain the unexplicable. I mean, after all, uncertainty, and I'm going to address that later, but uncertainty is an issue. People needed to know things. They wanted to know things that could impact their survival. And one way to explain them would involve religious explanations or mythology. Like, for example, creation stories. Creation mythologies are attempts to understand where things came from. And then there's also anthropomorphism. This is when we attribute human traits to things that are not human. So if one hears scratching in the wall and automatically jumps to ghosts and spirits, well, that's anthropomorphism, right? And the way we speak of dogs sometimes is very anthropomorphic. Well, anthropomorphism is a way to make this strange, sometimes scary, frightening world a more comforting place. it helps us relate to it. And so that's been another explanation for the existence of religion. In other words, there are beings, not unlike humans, but infinitely more powerful and wise, that are actually moving the heavens, quote unquote. So that's another attempt. Secondly, there are altered states of consciousness, and these are found in most of the world's societies, ASCs. Spirit possession is one example. Schizophrenia, any pharmacologically induced hallucination, sometimes physiological or psychological distress can result in an ASC. Rhythmic music and drumming have often been associated with trance and possession. And of course, all these things take us to a different place that is outside the normal everyday world we live in. So I think you can see where people are going with this. It's easy to make that small step towards the idea that there's another realm of experience, perhaps a supernatural, what we would call a supernatural realm. I should mention that shamanism actually is one of the oldest forms of religion, and shamanism involves a shaman during a trance experience actually traveling. Of course, this is the claim, right? They claim to travel to the spirit world and have an audience with the spirits and gods and bring that information back with them to help people in this real world. So even shamanism, one of the oldest forms of religion, is closely associated with the ASCs, altered states of consciousness. And then thirdly, another notion is that perhaps religion has a ritualistic origin. After all, rituals are common in the animal kingdom. And think about it, rituals give us and I'm going to insert parenthetically, false. Religions give us a false sense of power, right? We think we have some control over something. Think of magic as practiced by tribal indigenous peoples. Anytime they're involved in some dangerous, unpredictable activity, often a lot of magic is used to help guarantee a positive result. And clearly then, there must be a source of this power. And this source must be extra-human. In other words, it must come from something outside of ourselves. As far as the nature and form of early religion, well, since religion, in my opinion, is largely ideological, psychological, if you will, mental, whatever term you want to use, it's virtually impossible to actually determine the nature and form of early religion. But I should point out, and you've read about this already, the divine goddess that was present in, let's say, greater European society around 30,000 years ago. A number of Venus, so-called Venus figurines. That term is not the most popular term today because it seems to connote something, but nevertheless it's the term that's used. But these figures of women at various stages of life, including pregnancy and old age, seem to indicate that there was an inordinate amount of attention paid to the female gender. And in fact, some posit a divine goddess and so-called goddess religions. And this makes sense because, after all, people associated fecundity, which is the quality of being fertile, agricultural success, the renewal of springtime, birth, all these things were associated with females. And these things were all eminently important in early human societies. So it would make sense that the female form was actually venerated and worshipped at one time, which unfortunately fell by the wayside as plant and animal domestication began in 10,000 BCE, and then later as the so-called great world religions arose, many of them starkly and strictly patriarchal, arose anywhere from about 2,000 to about 5,000 years ago. And once that happened, it was sort of game over for the notion of the female divinity. Lastly, the author talks about the evolution of religion. And I'd just like to mention here that really evolutionary schemes don't really work too well today, because in fact we see all forms of religion, everything from animism to polytheism to henotheism to monotheism, practiced somewhere today. But I would like to note that a lot of people are not aware. They often associate monotheism with Judaism, but actually the earliest form of monotheism is Egyptian. The pharaoh Akhenaten actually worshipped the one high god, Aton. And this was around 1350 BCE or so. And where do we place that in Old Testament chronology? Well, the time of Moses was around 1300 BCE or so. So this predates monotheism in Judaism. Now finally, as far as my basic notion regarding the origin of religion, the first Homo sapiens, as I mentioned earlier, are dated back to 195,000 years ago. And those specimens are known as Omo 1 and Omo 2. They were found by the Omo River in Ethiopia. And the fossil specimens show all the hallmarks of modern, anatomically modern Homo sapiens. And they've been independently dated and verified by a number of different laboratories to be about 195,000 years old. So that's a pretty safe date. And so I would posit that at that point then, we have people existing that have the intellectual capacity that we have, and obviously everything else that we have as well in regard to mental faculties. So my earliest date for the origin of religion, well, I should say my latest date would be about 195,000 years ago. It might have been around before then, because after all, before then, we were still developing into Homo sapiens. There were earlier forms of Homo. Religion may have been there as well. But I think we can safely say, certainly by at least 195,000 years ago, there are people like ourselves who had the ability to think like we think about things. And as far as what motivated them, I would say uncertainty, finitude, and mortality would be the three most important things. Uncertainty meaning that we have lots of questions about things that we cannot answer. Things seem to happen that are beyond our control. It's a frightening, scary world. And in order to gain some kind of control, at least psychologically, we posit the existence of God or gods and religious and mythological explanations for things like creation mythologies. Finitude has to do with the fact that we're just humans and we're finite beings, and nature actually rules over us. So there's only so much we can do about things. We are essentially powerless in the face of nature. So again, there's this need to reach out for another source of power to comfort us. And then, of course, there's mortality. And questions of the afterlife, meaning and purpose, all these existential issues that no doubt motivated people to come up with religious or mythological ideas